Out of every 100 serial killers, only 3% are caught while they're still actively killing. The Fall shows what happens when a detective gets dangerously close to becoming part of that statistic. 3 seasons, one predator, and the most unsettling cat and mouse game you'll ever see. Gillian Anderson stars as Detective Superintendent Stella Gibson, investigating a politically sensitive murder in Belfast. But what starts as a procedural quickly becomes something much more psychological and disturbing. What makes this series brilliant is how it subverts everything you expect from a crime drama. Paul Spector is identified to the audience as the killer from the very start. He hides in plain sight. A father, husband, and professional man. A bereavement counselor. We know who the killer is from episode 1, but that knowledge makes everything more terrifying, not less. Gillian Anderson's performance as Stella Gibson is absolutely phenomenal. She brings this cold, calculating intelligence to the role that feels both admirable and slightly unsettling. Gibson isn't your ordinary TV detective. She's methodical, unemotional, and completely focused on the psychology of her suspect. Anderson makes her fascinating to watch. Jamie Dornan as Paul Spector is equally compelling. On the surface, he is socially competent, persuasive, and manipulative. His family provides him with the perfect cover. Dornan plays him with this quiet menace that's absolutely chilling. You can see how he fools everyone around him while we know exactly what he's capable of. The series was created by Alan Cubitt, and his writing is incredibly smart. Cubitt was inspired by guitar manufacturing companies when naming some of his characters. Stella, Gibson, and Spector are brands of guitar. These little details show the level of thought that went into every aspect of the show. How this series examines the violence against women is notable. The series doesn't exploit or sensationalize the murders. It examines them. Gibson's character serves as this feminist voice calling out the systemic issues that allow predators like Spector to operate. It's smart, relevant social commentary wrapped in a psychological thriller. The cinematography is gorgeous but unsettling. Belfast becomes this character itself, beautiful but dangerous, familiar but hiding secrets. The show uses the city's political history as backdrop, adding another layer of tension to everything. It follows a serial murderer named Paul Spector in Belfast, but it's really about the psychology of both hunter and hunted. By the end, you're not sure who's more dangerous, the killer or the detective obsessed with catching him. Let's look at how this psychological nightmare unfolds over 3 seasons. Season 1. We set the sails in Belfast, Northern Ireland, where Detective Superintendent Stella Gibson arrives from London's Metropolitan Police to review a murder case that has political implications. The victim is Alice Munro, the daughter-in-law of Morgan Munro, who chairs the Northern Ireland Policing Executive. Local police have classified it as a burglary gone wrong, but Gibson immediately spots inconsistencies that suggest something much more sinister. We meet Paul Spector, a seemingly ordinary family man living in Belfast with his wife Sally Ann and their 2 young children, Olivia and Liam. Sally Ann works as a neonatal nurse and is completely devoted to Paul, though she's never met his family and sometimes feels uneasy about gaps in his past. Paul works as a bereavement counselor, helping families cope with loss, which gives him the perfect cover for his true nature. Paul's method is disturbingly meticulous. He stalks professional women, learning their daily routines, their work schedules, their personal lives. He breaks into their homes repeatedly before the actual attack, familiarizing himself with the layout, taking photographs, and stealing personal items as trophies. His murders are carefully planned psychological exercises, not random acts of violence. Gibson reviews the Alice Munro crime scene with fresh eyes and immediately recognizes the staging. The body has been posed in a specific way, with the victim's clothing arranged deliberately. The crime scene tells a story that the local police missed. This is the work of a serial killer with a specific methodology and victim type. Paul's next victim is Sarah Kay, a young architect who lives alone in a modern apartment. He has been stalking her for weeks, learning her routine, entering her home while she's at work. Paul waits for her to return home one evening, hiding in her apartment. When Sarah arrives, Paul attacks her, attempting to strangle her with her own tights. But Sarah fights back violently, clawing at his face and leaving deep scratches. Paul manages to complete the murder, but is visibly shaken by the resistance he encountered. Gibson's investigation reveals disturbing connections between the victims. All are professional women in their 20s and 30s, all live alone, all are killed in their homes, and all are posed in similar ways post-mortem. She starts building a detailed psychological profile of the killer, recognizing patterns that the local police completely missed. Her experience with similar similar cases in London gives her insights that prove crucial. Paul's home life becomes increasingly complicated when he starts an inappropriate relationship with Katie Benedetto, the 15-year-old babysitter who looks after his children. Katie is infatuated with Paul, seeing him as sophisticated and worldly compared to boys her own age. Paul manipulates her feelings, using her attraction to him while carefully hiding his true nature. The relationship becomes sexual, with Paul grooming Katie systematically. Sally Ann becomes unwittingly embroiled in Paul's crimes when she provides him with false alibis to the police. She genuinely believes she's protecting her innocent husband from unfair suspicion, not knowing she's actually helping a serial killer evade justice. Paul's manipulation of his wife is as calculated as his manipulation of his victims. The investigation intensifies when Gibson realizes the killer has inside knowledge of police procedures and victim information. She begins to suspect someone with access to information about the victims and the ongoing investigation. Paul's job as a bereavement counselor gives him access to vulnerable families and detailed information about recent deaths, which he uses to identify potential victims. Paul plans his next attack on Annie Brawley, a successful solicitor who represents victims of domestic violence. He breaks into her home and waits for her to return, but Annie arrives with a friend from work. Paul is forced to improvise, attacking both women in a violent struggle. Annie survives, but is severely injured and traumatized. Her friend is killed in the attack. This deviation from his usual pattern gives Gibson new evidence to work with and proves the killer is becoming more desperate. The season builds to a dramatic confrontation when Gibson's investigation leads her dangerously close to Paul's identity. Through careful detective work and psychological profiling, she begins to narrow down the list of suspects. Paul realizes he's being hunted and begins planning to flee Belfast with his family. After a temporary separation where Sally Ann discovers Paul's affair with Katie, she reconciles with him and agrees to leave Ireland, not knowing she's helping a killer escape justice. Season 2. Season 2 brings Spector and his family back from their bolt hole to Belfast, where he kidnaps a former lover, Rose, in revenge for her having helped Gibson identify him as the serial killer. Paul returns to Belfast under a false identity, but Gibson has been waiting for him. Paul's psychological state deteriorates as the pressure mounts. He becomes increasingly erratic, making mistakes that bring him closer to capture. Gibson has been working with psychological profilers to understand his mindset better. She becomes dangerously obsessed with getting inside his head. The season focuses heavily on the psychological cat-and-mouse game between Gibson and Spector. Gibson orders extensive surveillance on Spector and his family. Paul knows he's being watched but continues his activities, almost daring Gibson to catch him. His relationship with his family becomes more strained. Sally Ann is pregnant with her third child, and the stress of their situation is taking its toll. Paul's behavior becomes more controlling and manipulative, even with his own family. The season culminates in a dramatic siege when police finally corner Paul in his apartment. He takes his own family hostage, including his pregnant wife and children. Gibson tries to negotiate with him, but Paul's mental state has deteriorated to the point where he's unpredictable and dangerous. During the siege, Paul is shot by police marksmen. He survives but is critically injured. The season ends with him in a coma, leaving Gibson without the psychological closure she's been seeking. Season 3. As Spector, now in police custody, recovers from being shot, Gibson prepares an interrogation that she hopes will see him confess and be convicted. But even in handcuffs, the handsome murderer proves to be quite uniquely dangerous. Paul wakes up from his coma claiming to have no memory of his crimes. He exhibits signs of amnesia, though Gibson suspects he's faking it. The season becomes a psychological battle between Gibson's determination to get a confession and Paul's manipulation of his supposed memory loss. Gibson brings in psychiatric experts to evaluate Paul's condition. The doctors are divided. Some believe his amnesia is genuine. Others think he's manipulating everyone. Gibson refuses to accept that Paul might not remember his crimes, seeing it as another form of manipulation. Paul's behavior in custody is calculated and disturbing. He maintains his innocent facade while subtly manipulating staff and other inmates. Gibson sees through his act but struggles to prove he's faking his condition. The season explores the psychological toll the case has taken on Gibson. She's become so obsessed with Paul that it's affecting her judgment and her relationships. Her colleagues worry that she's losing her objectivity. Paul's family situation becomes more complex as Sally Ann tries to distance herself and the children from him. She's finally beginning to see the truth about her husband, but the psychological damage is already done. The climax comes when Gibson finally gets her chance to interrogate Paul properly. Their conversations are psychological warfare. Paul is trying to get inside Gibson's head while she attempts to break through his defenses. The tension between them is palpable and dangerous. Paul's facade finally cracks when he reveals details about his crimes that only the killer would know. Gibson realizes she's been right all along. He's been manipulating everyone, but the revelation comes at a cost, as Paul's true nature is more disturbing than even Gibson expected. The series ends with a shocking twist when Paul, realizing he's been caught, attempts to strangle Gibson during their final interview. The psychological hunter becomes the hunted in a terrifying reversal that brings the series full circle. The Fall concludes with Gibson finally getting the psychological victory she's been seeking, but at a tremendous personal cost. Paul Spector's manipulation and violence left lasting damage on everyone who came into contact with him. What did you think about the psychological games between Gibson and Spector? Do you believe someone can truly forget committing murder? Or was Paul manipulating everyone until the very end? Share your thoughts in the comments. Hit the subscribe button if you like this recap and turn on the notification bell not to miss any episode.